At dawn, the battlefield was silent, but beneath the mud and fog, millions of men were already awake, waiting for orders, waiting for artillery, waiting for death. World War I was not just a clash of empires or a conflict drawn on maps by generals far from the front. It was a daily struggle for survival fought by ordinary soldiers whose lives were transformed into a relentless cycle of fear, endurance, and unimaginable hardship. In this video, we will uncover 20 fascinating and often shocking facts about the daily lives of World War I soldiers, what they ate, how they slept, how they fought, how they coped with terror, and how the war reshaped their humanity forever. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. The First World War marked a brutal turning point in modern warfare. For the soldiers on the front lines, life was defined by trenches carved into the earth like open graves. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across Europe, especially along the Western Front, forming a scar that refused to heal for 4 long years. Men lived inside these narrow channels day and night, surrounded by mud, rats, lice, and the constant threat of enemy fire. Letters and diaries from soldiers described the trenches not as defensive positions, but as prisons where time itself seemed to stop. One of the most striking realities of trench life was the mud. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp where boots were sucked into the ground and bodies disappeared beneath the surface. Soldiers wrote about standing in water for days without removing their boots, leading to a condition known as trench foot. This painful and sometimes fatal illness caused feet to rot, swell, and turn black due to prolonged exposure to cold and moisture. Medical reports from the time show that tens of thousands of soldiers were hospitalized or permanently disabled because of it, not by enemy bullets, but by the environment they lived in. Sleep, something taken for granted in civilian life, became a rare and fragile luxury. Soldiers slept whenever they could, sitting, standing, or lying on wooden planks covered in mud. Artillery fire often continued throughout the night, shaking the ground and preventing rest. Many soldiers suffered from extreme exhaustion, and some fell asleep even while shells exploded nearby. Personal accounts reveal that the human body adapted to constant danger in disturbing ways, learning to rest in moments of chaos because there was no alternative. Food was another daily struggle. Rations were basic, repetitive, and often inadequate. Soldiers survived on canned meat, hard biscuits, bread, tea, and occasionally soup. Fresh food was rare near the front lines, and when it arrived, it was often spoiled by the time it reached the trenches. Diaries frequently mention hunger as a constant companion. In some cases, soldiers scavenged abandoned farms or relied on food sent from home. For many, the arrival of mail was not just a morale boost, but a lifeline to survival. Rats were everywhere. The trenches were infested with enormous rats that fed on scraps, garbage, and sometimes the bodies of fallen soldiers left in no man's land. Letters describe rats as fearless creatures that ran across sleeping men and gnawed at their belongings. Some soldiers even tried to kill them for sport, though the rats always returned. These infestations spread disease and added to the psychological torment of trench life, reinforcing the feeling that the soldiers were living in conditions barely fit for animals. Lice were just as common and even harder to eliminate. Known as cooties, lice caused constant itching and skin infections. Soldiers attempted to burn them out of their clothes with candles, but this provided only temporary relief. Medical records indicate that lice also contributed to trench fever, a debilitating illness that caused severe pain and prolonged weakness. Hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain, and the constant discomfort wore down morale over time. Despite these conditions, soldiers developed routines to survive mentally as well as physically. Daily tasks like repairing trenches, standing guard, and cleaning weapons provided a sense of structure in an otherwise chaotic existence. Many units created informal traditions, jokes, and songs to cope with fear. Dark humor became a defense mechanism, a way to laugh at death rather than surrender to it. Historians studying soldiers' letters often note how humor persisted even in the most desperate circumstances. Fear was omnipresent, but it was not always expressed openly. Soldiers rarely wrote about fear directly, instead describing physical sensations, shaking hands, dry mouths, racing hearts before going over the top during an attack. Charging across no man's land meant exposing oneself to machine gun fire, artillery, and gas. Casualty rates were devastating. Some attacks resulted in tens of thousands of deaths in a single day. Yet soldiers continued to follow orders, driven by duty, camaraderie, and the powerful bond formed with the men beside them. The soundscape of the war was unforgettable. Veterans later recalled that the constant thunder of artillery haunted them long after the war ended. Shells screamed through the air, exploded with earth-shaking force, and left behind craters large enough to swallow buildings. This relentless noise contributed to what was then called shell shock, a condition now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers suffering from shell shock exhibited tremors, paralysis, nightmares, and emotional numbness. At the time, many were misunderstood or even punished for what was seen as weakness. Communication was limited and dangerous. Runners carried messages through trenches and across open ground under fire. Telephone lines were frequently destroyed by shelling. Pigeons were used to deliver critical information when all other methods failed. Some pigeons became war heroes, credited with saving entire units by delivering messages through gunfire. These fragile methods highlight how disconnected and vulnerable soldiers often were, especially despite the massive scale of the war. Weather played a cruel role in daily life. Winters were brutally cold, especially during the early years of the war when soldiers lacked proper clothing. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Summers brought heat, flies, and the stench of decay. The bodies of fallen soldiers could remain unburied for weeks or months, and the smell became an inescapable part of trench life. Veterans later described how certain smells could instantly transport them back to the front, even decades later. Friendship was one of the few comforts available. Soldiers formed deep bonds with their comrades, often closer than family. These relationships were forged under fire and sustained by shared suffering. The loss of a friend was devastating, sometimes more painful than physical wounds. Letters home reveal that soldiers often avoided describing deaths in detail, perhaps to shield loved ones from the reality they themselves could not escape. Moments of humanity still emerged amid the violence. One of the most famous examples is the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers on opposing sides temporarily ceased fighting, exchanged gifts, and even played football in no man's land. While rare, such moments remind us that the soldiers were not driven by hatred for each other, but by orders from above and circumstances beyond their control. Medical care was rudimentary and overwhelmed by the scale of the war. Wounded soldiers were often treated in makeshift aid stations close to the front, then transported to field hospitals. Infections were common, and amputations were frequently performed to save lives. The sight of wounded men, the screams, and the blood left lasting impressions on those who witnessed it. Survival often depended on luck, how quickly a soldier was found, how clean the wound was, and whether medical help arrived in time. As days turned into months and months into years, many soldiers experienced a gradual loss of innocence. The war stripped away illusions of glory and honor, replacing them with a grim understanding of survival. Veterans later described feeling disconnected from civilian life, unable to explain what they had endured. The battlefield became a world apart,
governed by its own rules and realities. By the end of the first year of war, it was already clear that this conflict would not be short or glorious. Soldiers realized they were trapped in a grinding stalemate where progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Yet they endured, adapted, and survived in ways that continue to astonish historians today. This was the hidden life of World War I soldiers, a life defined not just by combat, but by mud, hunger, fear, friendship, and resilience. And this is only the beginning. As the war dragged on, soldiers learned that survival depended not only on courage, but on adaptation. The front lines of World War I were a brutal classroom, where men were forced to learn new ways to endure constant danger. Every day presented fresh threats, and every small mistake could mean death. Veterans later recalled that after a certain point, fear did not disappear. It became normalized, woven into daily existence like breathing. One of the most psychologically draining aspects of trench life was waiting. Battles were moments of intense violence, but they were separated by long periods of anticipation. Soldiers waited for orders, for attacks, for bombardments, for relief. This waiting was often worse than combat itself. Diaries describe men staring at the trench walls, listening for sounds that might signal an enemy attack. The human mind, deprived of certainty, filled the silence with imagined horrors. Gas warfare introduced a new and terrifying dimension to soldiers' lives. Chlorine, phosgene, and later mustard gas crept silently across the battlefield, seeping into trenches and lungs alike. Gas masks became constant companions, worn at the slightest alarm. Soldiers trained themselves to react within seconds because hesitation could be fatal. First-hand accounts describe the panic of gas attacks, men fumbling with masks, eyes burning, lungs collapsing. Mustard gas did not always kill immediately, but it caused horrific burns and long-term suffering, leaving survivors permanently scarred. Soldiers also faced the constant threat of snipers. A single exposed head above the trench line could draw instant fire. Periscopes were used to observe enemy positions, and helmets were designed to protect against shrapnel rather than bullets. Even small daily actions, such as fetching water or repairing wire, became life-threatening tasks. Many soldiers were killed during routine duties, reinforcing the sense that death could come at any moment without warning. The relationship between soldiers and their officers was complex. Some officers shared the dangers of the front, earning deep respect from their men. Others remained distant, enforcing discipline from relative safety. Military discipline was harsh, and desertion or disobedience could lead to severe punishment, including execution. Historical records show that thousands of soldiers were court-martialed during the war, many suffering not from cowardice, but from mental collapse caused by prolonged exposure to trauma. Despite exhaustion and fear, soldiers found ways to cope. Writing letters home was one of the most powerful emotional outlets. These letters often avoided graphic descriptions, focusing instead on reassurance. Soldiers protected their families from the truth, even as they lived inside it. Censorship also shaped communication, limiting what could be written. Still, between the lines, loved ones could sense the strain and longing for normal life. Religion and superstition played important roles in daily survival. Many soldiers carried religious symbols, lucky charms, or personal objects believed to offer protection. Some units developed rituals before battles, small acts meant to bring comfort or control in an uncontrollable environment. Historians have noted that belief systems became psychological armor, helping soldiers face situations where logic offered no comfort. Nighttime was particularly dangerous. Darkness provided cover for raids, patrols, and surprise attacks. Soldiers crept through no man's land, cutting wire, gathering intelligence, or ambushing enemy trenches. These night operations required nerves of steel. The slightest noise could reveal a position and trigger deadly retaliation. Veterans later described night raids as some of the most terrifying experiences of the war, where fear was amplified by uncertainty and silence. The bodies of fallen soldiers remained a constant presence. In many areas, it was impossible to recover the dead immediately. Corpses lay between the lines, sometimes visible for weeks. Soldiers learned to live with this reality, though it never became easy. The sight of fallen comrades served as a constant reminder of mortality and the thin line between life and death. Some soldiers gave names to the dead they passed daily, a strange attempt to humanize the inescapable. Medical evacuation was slow and dangerous. Wounded soldiers often lay in shell holes for hours or days before being rescued. Stretcher bearers risked their lives to retrieve the injured under fire. Even when a soldier reached medical care, survival was uncertain. Infection, blood loss, and shock claimed many lives that might have been saved in later wars. Yet medical innovations emerged from necessity, laying the groundwork for modern trauma care. Morale fluctuated constantly. Victories lifted spirits, while failed offensives crushed them. Soldiers followed news from other fronts, clinging to rumors of breakthroughs or peace negotiations. Newspapers and official reports often painted an optimistic picture, disconnected from the reality of the trenches. This gap between propaganda and lived experience deepened disillusionment among many troops. Leave rotations offered brief relief. Soldiers sent away from the front experienced a surreal contrast between civilian life and the battlefield. Cafes, laughter, and normal routines felt unreal after months in the trenches. Many veterans wrote that returning from leave was harder than going the first time, as it forced them to confront what they had lost. The front lines reshaped their identities, creating a divide that could never be fully crossed again. Camaraderie remained one of the strongest forces sustaining soldiers. Shared danger created unbreakable bonds. Men relied on each other not just for survival, but for emotional stability. In moments of crisis, these bonds often outweighed fear. Soldiers advanced not for abstract ideals, but for the friends beside them. This loyalty became one of the defining characteristics of trench warfare. Over time, soldiers developed a fatalistic acceptance of risk. Many believed that survival was a matter of fate. This belief helped them function under constant threat, reducing paralyzing fear. Psychologists studying wartime behavior later noted that this mindset allowed soldiers to continue fighting despite conditions that would otherwise overwhelm the human psyche. As the war entered its later years, the cumulative toll became impossible to ignore. Physical wounds healed slowly, if at all. Psychological scars deepened. Soldiers aged rapidly, both in appearance and outlook. The optimism of early enlistment was replaced by grim determination. They fought not for glory, but because survival demanded it. World War I was not just a test of military strength, but of human endurance. The soldiers who lived through it faced challenges that reshaped their bodies, minds, and souls. Their experiences offer a window into the true cost of industrial warfare, a cost measured not only in casualties, but in the lives.
By the later stages of World War I, survival itself had become an act of resistance. Soldiers no longer measured time in days or weeks, but in offensives, bombardments, and rotations away from the front. Many veterans later admitted that they could not remember entire months of their service clearly. The war blurred into a continuous state of tension, where exhaustion dulled memory and instinct replaced reflection. One of the most profound impacts of the war on soldiers' lives was psychological trauma. What was once dismissed as cowardice or weakness slowly came to be recognized as a genuine condition. Shell shock, a term born in the trenches, described a wide range of symptoms: uncontrollable shaking, loss of speech, confusion, nightmares, and emotional numbness. Some soldiers were unable to return to the front, while others were forced back despite their condition. Medical reports from the period reveal a tragic misunderstanding of mental injury, with many sufferers punished rather than treated. The stigma surrounding psychological breakdown was severe. Soldiers feared being labeled cowards more than being wounded physically. As a result, many concealed their suffering, pushing themselves beyond their limits. Letters and diaries show subtle signs of mental strain: fragmented thoughts, repeated phrases, and sudden changes in tone. These documents provide haunting evidence of minds under siege. Brotherhood among soldiers deepened as the war progressed. Units that survived together through repeated battles developed a shared identity stronger than nationality or ideology. Veterans often remembered the faces and voices of their comrades more clearly than the battles themselves. This bond created a powerful sense of responsibility. Abandoning one's post meant abandoning the men who depended on you. Death became routine, yet never truly normal. Soldiers developed emotional distance as a coping mechanism, but the loss of a close friend could shatter this fragile barrier. Many described moments of overwhelming grief that had to be suppressed immediately in order to survive. There was no time to mourn properly. The war demanded constant forward motion, even when hearts were breaking. Letters from the front reveal a growing disconnect between soldiers and civilians. The realities of trench warfare were impossible to explain to those at home. When soldiers returned on leave, they often found themselves unable to relate to everyday conversations. Civilian concerns felt trivial compared to the constant presence of death. This emotional gap would persist long after the war ended. Music, poetry, and art emerged as unexpected outlets for expression. Soldiers wrote poems in trenches, sketched scenes of destruction, and composed songs that blended humor with despair. These creative acts were not hobbies, but survival tools. They allowed soldiers to reclaim fragments of their humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. As casualties mounted, replacements arrived at the front with little training and shattered illusions. Veteran soldiers often viewed these newcomers with a mix of pity and frustration. The cycle repeated itself: fresh faces, brief friendships, sudden losses. The constant turnover reinforced the sense that the war consumed lives endlessly, without pause or mercy. Technological advances continued to reshape daily life. Tanks appeared on the battlefield, bringing both hope and fear. Airplanes roared overhead, introducing soldiers to the concept of war in the sky. While these innovations promised breakthroughs, they also intensified the scale of destruction. Soldiers on the ground experienced these machines as distant forces beyond their control, adding to the feeling of powerlessness. Discipline remained strict, even as morale declined. Some soldiers openly questioned the purpose of continued offensives that resulted in massive casualties for minimal gains. Mutinies occurred in several armies, not as acts of betrayal, but as desperate protests against unbearable conditions. Historical records show that these mutinies were often driven by exhaustion, hunger, and a belief that sacrifices were no longer justified. Food shortages worsened as supply lines stretched thin. Rations shrank, and hunger returned as a daily concern. Soldiers scavenged, traded, and improvised. Malnutrition weakened bodies already strained by constant exposure and stress. Medical officers warned that hunger reduced combat effectiveness, but solutions were limited. The presence of civilians near the front added another layer of complexity. Soldiers encountered displaced families, destroyed villages, and refugees fleeing the fighting. These encounters humanized the broader impact of the war.
Diaries describe moments when soldiers shared rations with civilians or helped rebuild shelters, small acts of compassion amid widespread devastation. As the war entered its final phase, rumors of peace circulated alongside renewed offensives. Soldiers learned to distrust hope. Many had experienced false endings before, yet the possibility of survival beyond the trenches lingered in every conversation. Some soldiers began to imagine life after the war, while others could no longer envision a future outside the battlefield. Physical wounds accumulated. Soldiers carried scars, missing limbs, damaged lungs, and impaired vision. Medical advancements saved lives, but could not restore what was lost. The sight of wounded comrades returning from the front served as a grim preview of what awaited many survivors. The war reshaped masculinity and identity. Pre-war ideals of heroism and honor clashed with the reality of industrial slaughter. Soldiers emerged changed, often struggling to reconcile who they had been with who the war had forced them to become. This internal conflict would define a generation. World War I demanded everything from those who fought it: strength, loyalty, sanity, and youth. The soldiers endured not because they believed the war was just, but because survival required endurance. Their stories reveal the immense human cost behind every offensive, every line on a map, every victory claimed. And as the guns continued to fire, one question haunted every trench: when would it end?
When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, many soldiers did not celebrate. The end of the fighting did not mean the end of the war for those who had lived it. For millions of men, survival was only the beginning of a new struggle, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The transition from the trenches back to civilian life was often more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Soldiers returned home physically and psychologically transformed. Some bore visible wounds, missing limbs, damaged faces, scarred bodies that told silent stories of the front. Others carried injuries no one could see. Nightmares, sudden panic, emotional detachment, and guilt haunted them. Veterans spoke of waking up convinced they were back in the trenches, reacting to everyday sounds as if they were artillery fire. Society was unprepared to understand what these men had endured. Many soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Jobs were scarce, economies were damaged, and the world they returned to felt unfamiliar. The discipline and constant danger of war had shaped their behavior, and normal routines felt meaningless by comparison. Letters written years after the war reveal a sense of alienation, a feeling that part of them had been left behind in the mud and wire of the battlefield. Public memory of the war often clashed with personal experience. Official ceremonies emphasized victory, honor, and sacrifice, while veterans remembered fear, loss, and exhaustion. Monuments listed names, but could not capture the daily suffering behind each one. Some soldiers attended memorials in silence, unable to articulate emotions that words could not hold. Medical systems struggled to cope with the long-term consequences of the war. Hospitals treated thousands of amputees and disabled veterans. Prosthetics improved, but pain and limitations remained. Psychological trauma was still poorly understood, and many veterans received little support. Some turned to alcohol to numb their memories. Others withdrew from society altogether. A generation carried wounds that never healed. Yet resilience emerged in unexpected ways. Veterans formed organizations to support one another, creating communities built on shared understanding. These bonds, forged in war, extended into peace. Former soldiers found comfort among those who did not need explanations. Brotherhood did not end with the armistice. It evolved into lifelong connections. The war also reshaped how nations understood combat. Military leaders studied the experiences of soldiers, recognizing that morale, mental health, and living conditions were as important as weapons and tactics. The brutal lessons of trench warfare influenced future military planning.
though history would later show that humanity had not learned enough. For many soldiers, memory became both a burden and a responsibility. Some chose silence, refusing to speak of the war. Others became storytellers, historians, and witnesses, determined to preserve the truth of what they had lived through. Diaries, letters, and memoirs became invaluable records, allowing future generations to understand the human cost behind the statistics. World War I did not just change borders, it changed people. The soldiers who fought in it were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. They endured hunger, fear, filth, and loss on a scale never seen before. Their lives were shaped by moments of terror and acts of courage that history books often summarize in a single sentence. The trenches taught soldiers harsh truths about survival, loyalty, and fragility. They revealed how quickly civilization can collapse and how deeply humanity can persist even in the darkest conditions. The war stripped away illusions, but it also exposed the strength of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. Today, more than a century later, the echoes of World War I still resonate. Modern warfare, trauma awareness, and international relations all carry the imprint of that conflict. Understanding the daily lives of the soldiers who fought it allows us to see the war not as a distant event, but as a human experience lived one heartbeat at a time. These were not just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, friends, and dreamers whose lives were forever altered by a war that promised glory and delivered suffering. Remembering their stories is not only an act of history, it is an act of respect. If you stayed with us until the end, leave a comment below using the keyword trenches so we know you watched the full documentary. Share your thoughts on what impacted you most about the lives of World War I soldiers. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and continue watching the next documentaries appearing on your screen now. Their stories deserve to be remembered, and you are part of keeping that memory alive.